Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining in. It's my pleasure to moderate this session. My name is Tapo Duole. I'm the Director General of the Office of Public-Private Partnerships in Ogun State, Nigeria, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. Now, we have this year's theme for our World Association of Public-Private Partnerships Roundtable 2025, and this is day 2. Day 1 was yesterday, and we were so fortunate to have a good caliber of panelists. And we looked at some very topical issues, which are so germane in the PPP space in Africa today. And PPP has become so important. It's becoming more and more germane for governments, for developers, and for financiers up and down the continent. And those issues continue. But the discussion continues, and we continue to have far-reaching solutions. The theme for this year, 2025, for our PPP is advancing infrastructure development in Africa, and then looking at strategies for project development and risk management. And this started yesterday. We had 2 sessions yesterday. We looked at project development and preparation, strategies for looking at challenges, investigating those challenges, and then sifting out the opportunities that exist in that space. We also looked at project structuring and for bankability. This is so important because, as we all know, PPPs must be bankable to be sustainable. And then today, we started with a 3rd session, and that looked at de-risking African infrastructure projects, solutions and strategies, managing risks and ensuring sustainability of PPP projects in Africa. Now, our session now, this is the 4th session, session 2 for day 2, and we'll be looking at fostering collaboration in African public-private partnership ecosystem, building synergy among governments, developers, and financiers for innovative infrastructure development in Africa. Now, we're very fortunate to have another great round of panelists with me this afternoon to engage and discuss these issues and how can we build synergy between governments and developers and financiers in the PPP ecosystem. And it's interesting, because when you look at public-private partnership, the public clearly is government, and that could be national or subnational. Developers, because they're needed to actually build, construct, lay down, provide and implement the infrastructure solutions that we're seeking. And then, of course, finance is so important. There needs to be funding that's sustainable and that will last and ensure that these projects are delivered. So that's what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. And to help you along, I have a great round of panelists who I'll be introducing now. I've got 4 panelists this afternoon. Now, in no particular order, I'll be introducing them. I have Meita Fani. Meita is the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, manager for the region covering Mozambique, Madagascar, the Comoros, Seychelles, and Eswatini. Meita is based in Maputo in Mozambique, and she oversees these 5 countries, and she leads the development and the implementation of IFC's strategy, which aims at increasing private sector-led investments through innovative financing mechanisms. Now, prior to this, Meita's experience is so wide, and she's been IFC's regional manager of PPPs advisory in Europe, where she was leading on business in advising European governments and robust, sustainable infrastructure and social service-related PPP projects. Meita is an Ivorian citizen. She holds a master's degree in economics from the National University of Cote d'Ivoire and a business degree from ESSEC Business School, or ESSEC Business School in France. Benita, good afternoon and welcome. We're very happy to have you in the panel this afternoon. Next, I'll be introducing Nasser Masood. Nasser is the founder and managing director of Concept Realization, a niche advisory firm in Dubai, specializing in PPPs and large infrastructure projects. Nasser is a member of the steering committee of the World Association of PPPs, and he's actually the chairman of the chapter on social sector PPPs, which is a specialism that Nasser has. He's a member of the leadership team of the MENA chapter, and he specializes in infrastructure investments and services with a focus, like I said, on the social sector. Nasser has over 30 years experience in partnerships and has worked on landmark transactions. He has worked in many parts of the world, including Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caribbean. Nasser has a master's degree in finance from the London Business School and a bachelor's in civil engineering, as well as a master's in construction economics and management, both from UCL. He's a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Nasser, welcome to the panel this afternoon. We're happy to have you here. Next, I'll be using Moshood Abalade. Moshood is the investment director, and he works with the project development team on Africa 50. Moshood is an infrastructure finance professional with project development and finance expertise in many African markets, and he has a keen interest in sustainable development and blocking the complexities of infrastructure development in Africa. He's currently an like I said, yes, investment director on the project development team, and he focuses on early stage infrastructure investment opportunities, particularly in the power sector and for transmission line PPPs. So he has an MBA from Wharton School, and also he has an additional MBA from ANSEAD. Welcome, Moshood. Welcome to the panel this afternoon. And last but not the least at all, I wish to introduce Lamin Fati. Lamin is the Director General of the Public-Private Partnership Department of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs in Banjul, the Gambia. He's a PPP specialist and a very seasoned government advisor. He's been very much involved in setting up the PPP Directorate in the Ministry of Finance in the Gambia. He has advanced the development of Gambia's national PPP policy and developed a PPP toolkit to facilitate the implementation and delivery of PPP projects in the Gambia. Lamin is an economist, and he holds an MSc in finance from the University of London. Welcome, Lamin, and welcome to the panel this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
So, we'll be having a discussion now, and with the help of the panelists, we hope to make inroads into looking at how we can build a synergy. We've mentioned that public-private partnership is a union or combination or collaboration, as some people like to say, between the public sector, that's government, and the private sector. And the private sector is divided into developers and financiers. And that goes across the spectrum of banks, companies who provide finance, investment companies, investor funds, as the case may be. And also large funders like the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. So we're on all these sectors are very well represented in the panel this afternoon. So let's go straight into this. I want to, I'll address my first question perhaps to you, Maita. Here's what I'm thinking. There are certain principles which are key in developing a successful PPP. But when you look at the combination of government and the private sector, can I ask you, what would you say are the key principles that would define a successful collaboration between government and developers and financiers in actually laying down a proper, sustainable, and successful PPP? Are you muted? I don't know if we can we hear? Can we hear you? Okay. I can't hear. I don't know if anybody else. Okay, yes. Please go ahead, Maitha. Just to confirm, has everybody got Maitha's audio? Can we hear her clearly? It's just mine.
Can people hear me?
We can now. Fantastic. We can. Thank you.
Excellent.
Please go ahead.
I'm
Thank
very
you.
sorry. Yeah.
No,
So good
go
afternoon
ahead.
again, and thank you for the question. So what is a successful collaboration in working on a PPP project, right? Something that makes PPP successful is the preparation, right? Because PPP is successful when the project has been well prepared and the risk has been well allocated to the best parties that can hold those risks. And to have a good preparation, you need to have a good team. You need to have the right team, the right stakeholders, and before you start everything, you need to be aligned on the objectives, on the expected outcome. What are we expecting from this PPP? What are we trying to solve? What is the problem which is being trying to solve? That is the first thing which is very important. Secondly, we need to have a champion, right? No matter how convinced we are of the objective, we need to have a champion. A champion means somebody at the decision-making level that can be heard, that is trusted, and that can be listened to. Somebody that can convey to the highest level of decision-making process issues or matters that are important during the preparation of the PPP. And then there's a need to have to have clarity on roles and responsibilities, because it's a complex process and it takes several stakeholders. You have, in my case, as a World Bank Group staff, we intervene in PPP as a lead advisor, principal advisor. So you have the advisor, you have the consultant, you have also the government team, and you have the private sector. So it is important from the beginning. Most of the time the lead advisor work for the government, for the contract, the party which is granting the PPP. So we need to clarify who is going to be doing what, at what time, and what is expecting from each of us. This means that from the beginning, the lead advisor has to agree with the government on the steering committee. This steering committee should be composed of all the key people, of member of government representative that needs to have a say in the decision or the sector which is considered for the PPP. It is very important. And once the steering committee is put in place and the lead advisor is confirmed, there's a need to have a timeline, an indicative timeline that will help follow the road of the preparation, but which can be adjusted as we go. A clear communication plan is definitely important, because it is important to agree on how we are going to communicate, how quickly people are going to be responsive, and also to have a communication plan toward the other stakeholders. You can have community involved in a PPP project because there might be some relocation. It could be like a port project. The workers are worried about what is going to happen to them after. There could be a PPP where there's a social plan. So all these aspects needs to be thought of ahead, not to be solving problems as they emerge. And the last thing on this particular question is capacity building. Depending on the environment, depending on the context, it is important as we move through the preparation of the project to ensure that people are capacitated so that they know why we are going through each step. And in some cases, some stakeholders are not used to it. So you need to take the time during the preparation process to make sure that people are really formed, trained, and informed about why are we going through these steps and how these steps are going to affect the result. So this is a nutshell what I can say to start with. Thank you. You're on mute, Dapo.
Thank you very much. My apologies. That's a great start. Thank you very much. And it's quite interesting when you look at PPPs across the board. It's comforting to note that there's certain things which are quite clear. And I like the way Mahida went into that. The preparation, the allocation of risk, which also came out in the earlier sessions on this roundtable, having a project champion, that's great. And also looking at the roles, the timeline, communication is key, very important. And also looking at capacity. And it's quite interesting because we're looking at implementing those points in the public sector and in the private sector. I want to look closely at the public sector, and I want to come to you now, Lamin, because you've been instructive in setting up the PPP directorate and leading, having a toolkit, and there are a lot of things that you've done under that directorate for the government of Gambia when it comes to PPPs. And I'm just wondering, if I were to ask you, how can African governments, if we are looking at that close synergy, how can African governments create an enabling and a regulatory framework, that can facilitate this synergy and this collaboration that we're looking at between the public sector and the private sector? So when you're looking at key PPP stakeholders, how can governments intervene and create that enabling environment that would assist all this synergy that we're talking about, Lamin? Can you unmute yourself, please? Can you unmute, please, Lamin? If you can hear me, I think you're still muted.
Yes, I'm here now.
Yes, thank you very much. We can hear you now.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I think this is something that we can dwell over it many times. There are a lot of approaches to it, but in terms of regulatory and institutional framework for the formation of a very laudable and reliable PPP, there are very relevant prerequisites that the government has to do. One of the keys is the establishment of a PPP framework. And then this framework will entail two components. We have the client PPP policy, and then also a PPP regulatory framework. The government needs to establish a very clear and transparent policies and laws that will govern PPP procurements as far as the PPP is concerned. And this framework should include the defining rules that the institution should have, the responsibilities, and the legal structure of the PPPs within the country. And this is what the government of the Gambia has started when we wanted to come in the formation of the Directorate of PPP. And then by these PPP policies, we have to define the objectives and then the scopes that's supposed to be implemented. Because not every procurement can go through PPP. You have some procurements that cannot be done through PPP. So all these ones should be in the policy framework that you want to establish. And then also secondarily, there should be a very defined institutional responsibilities and coordination. In promoting the institutional coordination and ensuring that different agencies work together to attain a very common objective that will reduce the bottlenecks and the streamlined implementation of this, then this should be done by meeting the collaboration of the decision makers. In that, you should have a very institutional responsibility from the PPP formulation, also to the implementation, which institutions should be implementing in institutions. And then you should also have the institutional responsibilities in terms of reviewing and approval of the PPPs. Then the other very relevant point that the government looked into is the public financial management frameworks. Because in every PPP, there must be some fiscal risks. So assessing the fiscal implementation of project is also very primary that the government have to look into. And then also in terms of budgeting for government commitments, there are some cases where government has to put some funds, or you have some PPP projects that PPP, and then those ones shouldn't be off balance sheet or off budget, but they should be in the national budget. So government should also be willing to have those ones when it's trying to show a seriousness in terms of committing into PPPs. Then we also look at the dedicated PPP units, because establishing a dedicated PPP unit within the government can help to centralize decision-making, also streamline processes as one step stop for all the PPP-related inquiries. This unit can also facilitate the coordinations between government ministries, government departments, and government agencies, as well as with private sectors. Then again, another framework that is very relevant is the operational guidelines, PPP operational guidelines. We also have what we call regulatory oversight and then risk mitigation. The operational guidelines that will be well defined, where the process or procurement process can be defined, and then steps will be articulated on what process do you do. And the regulations should also be provided that promote transparency procurement or transparent procurement, and then also reduce risks, such as the creation of the a framework for managing financial, political, and then environmental risks. And then again, which is very relevant, which is also an enticer for private sectors to come into PPP, is the risk-sharing mechanisms like government providing guarantees. This could include sovereign guarantees, letter of credits. Also, you can provide subsidies or even waivers or tax incentives. That will also be an enticer or an attraction for PPP or private investors to come and invest. Another very relevant that the government look at.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm just wondering, is it because you've mentioned something which I think is quite key. Government is a regulator, and I note that you mentioned frameworks, and I'm picking up on that because it looks like you're telling us that in the Gambia, one of the advantages and one of the key purposes of government is to be able to lay down proper, sustainable frameworks, which would cover regulatory and financial. And then also, I'm just wondering if I can key into that. You're mentioning that it's also helpful to have a specialist unit, because I guess when they do this over and over again, they become experts. And the reason why I drew this out is that this leads into my next question. I was trying to tie your experience in the public sector to what I want to ask NASA now about the private sector, you see, because one thing Lamin said is that the frameworks should also cover fiscal policies and financial regulations. And I'm wondering how this also affects the private sector, NASA. I'd like to ask you, if one looks at your experience as a PPP specialist in a niche practice, what would you say could be the innovative financing and structuring approach that can actually help to plug the infrastructure gap we have in Africa? Because one of the things we're talking about, we acknowledge the infrastructure gap, we're looking at strategies to help the collaboration. So when we're trying to introduce innovation, how can we foster synergy between the private sector and the public sector when we're looking at innovation in financial arrangements?
Thanks. I'm supposed to unmute myself, or am I am unmuted.
Yes, you're clear. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. I think that's a good question. And one thing just to kind of note, that when we talk about doing innovative financing and innovative structuring, we shouldn't just be looking at innovation for the sake of innovation. We should be looking at innovation to actually address the challenges. And I think when it comes to infrastructure projects and services that come out of them in Africa, there are some really unique challenges. There's the usual suspects like perceived risk, issues around transparency, stability, and so on, but also regulatory frameworks. And for financing, there's also the whole availability of liquidity in the market. And in particular, when it comes to liquidity for lending at long tenors at reasonable rates. And then when you put that with the limited fiscal capacity, you begin to understand what the scope of the challenges are. So in terms of innovation, I think first and foremost, the project has to be bankable. So any innovation that is there should be geared towards making that project bankable. So, what I always advocate in these kind of situations is not to just take something that's been done in the UK or in any other developed economy and just assume that it's going to work because it was bankable there. What's bankable in one country is not necessarily going to be bankable in another country. So you really need to look at it with that particular thing. And to structure the project in a way that leads to it being financed rather. So, make sure that structuring will lead to it. And that means getting the risk transfer and all those components done in a balanced way that addresses the key principles that you need. Now, to get that in place, an innovative approach would start by saying, so what is the purpose of this PPP? And I think sometimes we find that, if that question is sometimes unclear, or the answer to it is unclear. In particular, we see situations where there's lack of clarity over whether this is only about providing some infrastructure, or is it about providing the services that go with the infrastructure? And quite often, if you group up the infrastructure with the provision of services, you actually deliver much more value and you make the project more interesting. And that in itself can be an innovation, because when you look at saying, I don't just need a piece of infrastructure, I need services. Let's take healthcare as an example. Yes, you want to provide access and so on. And you can either approach that by saying, yeah, I need a hospital, or I need a series of clinics, or you can define it by saying, I need to deliver healthcare services to this population. When you pose the question in that way, which in my view is innovative, because oftentimes this is not how it's done, you allow room for the private partners to say, well, I can deliver the service with technology, with remote, with a provision of different types of services, with perhaps even restructuring the whole clinical pathway in relation to what you're doing there, to be able to deliver that service. And that can come out at significantly less cost, more efficiency, better access, and overall better patient experience. So the first thing really in innovation is to start by defining the project and asking what's the purpose and trying to configure it around that. And that in itself can then unlock wider funding, because it's one thing to say, I'm doing a project for as a piece of infrastructure, which then needs government to unlock certain fiscal resources that it has to be able to pay for that infrastructure over a long time period, with all the complications that can have. It's another thing to be able to say, well, okay, since I'm doing services, where are the different pockets of budget that I can tap into to actually fund that service? And it could be, if we go back to the healthcare example, it could be with the Ministry of Health, could also be with the Ministry of Works, could even come from Ministry of Finance, from Ministry of Social Services. And by pulling together several line items of budget, you're then able to provide more innovative ways to fund that project, and therefore give more certainty to the financiers and the investors in the project. Another thing is, in terms of structuring, is looking at whether this is going to be a user pay or a government pay project. And this is something that's sometimes gets confusing. And when I say confusing, sometimes there's a project that only lends itself to being government pay, but somehow a government department is looking to structure it as a user pay. And you have to ask yourself the question, do users pay for this service currently? And if they don't, then by making it a user pay instead of a government pay, you're automatically creating some political issues around it, because suddenly it'll look like it's privatization and so on. So that has to be addressed. And in that sense, it is relevant to define the project, define how the funding is going to come in, and how, if there's any payment coming in from users, what that is, and making sure that that's compatible with the current way in which people pay for a service. So if people don't pay for that, but if people are entitled to free education and they currently pay for that, then you can't have a system where it is paid. But certain innovations can come in if it costs the government a certain amount of money per year to, excuse me one moment. to have a child in education, then you can go down the path of, for example, a voucher system. And we've seen some of those kind of projects applied. And that can deliver more value than having in place, for example, a whole load of infrastructure-only school projects. Because the infrastructure-only school projects, nevertheless, still have to have teachers delivering curriculum, delivering all of the pedagogical services. Another way of innovation is, of course, to look at blended finance. And this is, of course, a very hot topic and has been for some time. And blended finance can come in from either public or from philanthropic sources, of course. And that can be, for example, take the form of grants or technical assistance or certain guarantees and insurances. But again, looking at blended finance as a way to kind of fill that viability gap for the funding can be quite significant in terms of how that project can be structured and then therefore financed. I'll mention a couple of other things. How am I doing?
No, go ahead. If you could just make that last point, please. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, the last one I wanted to mention in that case is looking at national infrastructure development funds. So I know some countries have created those, and they can play a very useful role if they come in to fill some of the gaps, correct some of the system issues that exist in a particular funding structure in a country. Where I've seen it not work well is where the infrastructure development funds come in to only replicate what the commercial banks are doing. And that doesn't, in my view, doesn't deliver much value. Yes, it adds more liquidity into the market, but it doesn't deliver any additional value. I'll stop there, and of course we can discuss some.
Thank you very much. I'll tell you what I drew from this, what I found very interesting, because the question was asking to address innovation. What I liked was that you said that the innovation, it shouldn't be just for innovation's sake, it should actually address challenges. And what we are talking about this afternoon is looking at addressing those challenges in innovative ways, in different ways to create synergy. And that's great. And that leads me to my next question to Mashoud, because Mashoud is an investment director, and you're looking at, investments and financing as well. And in that space, we're looking at how we can infuse priorities. Excuse me. Our investors and our developers have their priorities, and government needs to understand this. In the same way, government has its priorities, and our financiers and developers must understand government's thrust and approach in wanting to develop, to lay down and deliver infrastructures, as there be infrastructure developments. Now, what I'm looking at is this. What do investors prize, Mashoud, when PPP opportunities in Africa? Because they have their priorities, they have their criteria, and this needs to be intelligible to everybody in that PPP space in Africa. So, and how can projects be structured to align with those priorities and criteria that they have?
Thanks, Dapo. Good afternoon again, and good morning, everyone. So I think I'll take the second part of your question first, which is, how can projects be structured to align with investor expectation? I think primarily, everybody that has spoken today has spoken about bankability. I think when a project is bankable, right, you see everybody sitting at the table. But again, what does this mean, right? It depends on who's looking at the project. A bankable project to a lender, in terms of what the lender will prioritize is different from what the investor will prioritize. But I think ultimately, interests have to align at some point for projects to get done, right? So for example, when it comes to priorities for investors, I think there are a number of considerations and that have sort of different ranking orders, right? The first I would say is, on the capital side. Right, when we talk about projects in Africa and them not being able to be done, right, it's because, those projects cannot attract capital. So the first, priority for investors is risk-return alignment, right, which is that, there is risk in projects, there is risk in everything we do, right, but the truth is the return is an important consideration for investors. because on the one hand, capital has to be compensated, and that compensated has to be fair and commensurate with the risk that is being taken by the private sector or by that investor. Now, on the other hand, right, government, because the return is compensating for the risk. Now, if the government and private sector, they need to see eye to eye on the risks that are inherent in a project or in a country. Now, there is talk about perceived and actual risk when you're looking at projects in Africa, right? I think, if both parties, depending on how they are looking at the risk, right, they need to see it in such a way that, there is alignment, because only then can there now be constructive engagement, on the return, and then both parties can then work together to deliver a project that is bankable, right, for, whether it's for the government or for the private sector itself. So one priority there is, alignment on the risk and return that, that is inherent in a project, because capital recovery is very important. Now, return on that hand, relates to the equity that goes into projects and the project development capital that advances it to financial close or to bankability. The next priority, that I'd like to talk about is, ensuring that when you're looking at a project, from an investor standpoint, one important priority is, the appetite of lenders and DFIs. I think, as we all know, lenders contribute sometimes into this project up to 80% of the total funding requirement. Now, lenders typically, you won't find them at the table when these conversations are, at concept stage or when conversations begin. But it is very instructive to ensure that, their appetite is gauged very early on, given that they're just an important component of bankability assessment. So, and the appetite, as we all know, is typically impacted by geopolitical considerations, prudential limits, market conditions, and a host of other factors. So it is important that, lenders are also prioritized. I mean, it's very instructive. For every 20 cents I put in a project, I'm expecting a lender to put 80 cents on the same project. A third priority that I'd like to identify here is, around, I think I mentioned risk and return, right? I think by identifying risk is one thing to say, this is a risky project. But now the allocation of that risk, I think Mehita spoke about this earlier on, in terms of risk allocation. And the truth is, risk allocation in a particular PPP market or in a particular country is expected to evolve. But, at every point in time where projects are being done, risks have to be allocated in an efficient way. Some people like to use balanced, right? For me, it's not a question of the scale. It's a question of, at that point in time in the evolution of that market, who is best placed to manage market risk, right? When a particular sector is new or is nascent, it makes, and government is trying to crowd in capital to demonstrate that it is viable. I think it makes sense for government to take on market risk at the early stages of evolution, and later on, the private sector can then start to take the risk when there's a track record and when there are precedents around how those risks tend to crystallize, or whether they're actual or whether they are perceived, right? So governments here are encouraged to recognize the importance of market evolution when it comes to risk allocation, and then another sort of and very important priority for investors is regulatory and policy certainty, right? I think, Lamin had mentioned earlier, regulation is very important. Yes, it is important, but it's certainly because, as we know, regulation is tied to politics and the other way around, right? In most of our markets today, right? For investors need to do these projects. It requires long-term patient capital. And, that also has to be complemented with, certainty around policy, around regulation, because government commitment and their PPP track record tends to implicate the time it takes to get projects done. And when projects take too long, they get expensive. People think time is just something, but time is money. It costs money. If I put money into a project today, I've done my feasibility, but I can't sign the concession, then that capital is tied in that feasibility study, which at that point in time is just a document, But if government, moves very speedily, then that document could transform into value for government, for the users of the infrastructure, and for everybody around the table. So I think one key message I'd like to highlight here is that, people always say the laws have to be in place, PPP laws have to be there. It's one thing to write laws, it's another thing for laws to have, enablers around, for example, clear timelines to get things done. If you launch a tender, right, if you are asking the private sector to respond within a particular time frame, how have you charged yourself to respond as well, right, when those bids come in, so that you are able to restore, to maintain and sustain the confidence that the private sector has in the market, right? So, I think the key message here is that as government seeks to hold private sector accountable, government also needs to hold itself accountable for this thing to get done. And granted, when it comes to certainty around policy and time, there are certain factors that are beyond the control of government. But I think if all stakeholders sit down and work together to with a sense of urgency, because our needs are huge in Africa, the sense of urgency and the sense of priority is quite important, to get these things done. And then finally, one key requirement, for an institution like Africa 50, right, from our standpoint, we're a Pan-African institution, we've been set up by governments, but to act, as a bridge between the public and private sector. When we look at projects, one important priority for us is scalability, right? There are a lot of investors that go into different countries, they find a project that is good, and they want to do that project just on the basis of that project. For us at Africa 50, scalability is very important. It goes back to the point I made earlier about our needs being very huge. We see ourselves as a culture and flag carrier for PPPs on the continent, and to demonstrate to the rest of the world that African infrastructure is commercial and is viable, essentially inviting the rest of the world to come. So when you look at areas like, battery energy storage projects, when you look at transmission line PPPs or asset recycling, these are emerging infrastructure verticals that, but are inevitable if we are to achieve our infrastructure development goals on the continent. Yes. Right. Yes. A lot of governments are doing their first transactions in these spaces, or some might even get to do it. And I think what we're trying to encourage here is that, when you do your first project in a nascent space, it is very important to do projects that can lend themselves as templates for follow-on projects to be done. Because we are trying to create market here and not trying to get one project done, right? The needs are huge. I can imagine if we go across the country, the problems that we always highlight around how many people have access to electricity. So it's important that scalability is prioritized when it comes to these investments.
Okay. Thank you.
And by the way, I talked about asset recycling. Maybe just for the benefit of those on the webinar, it's a tool that is being deployed by Africa 50 to help African governments unlock capital that is immobilized in existing commercially viable infrastructure assets that have been built using government resources, using customary PPP principles. We are able to get these assets from government by way of a concession or whatever modality, and for a defined period. And the benefits, sort of allow governments to unlock immediate liquidity from these assets to either pay their existing debt obligations or fund further infrastructure, and also governments get the benefit of improved operations of these assets or expansion or upgrade of the assets, as the case may be. And I'm very happy that, Lamine is on this call. The first project that we've done on the continent is actually in the Gambia, the Senegambia Bridge, where the government has spent its resources to build the project. The project needed some improvements in terms of operations, and government had, some challenges on the fiscal side to fund further infrastructure. And through this project, the government of the Gambia was able to unlock $100 million to fund further infrastructure. So, PPPs are not just about greenfield projects. They can be done with brownfield projects to actually meet, needs that are very urgent.
I'm quite happy that you mentioned Lamine, actually. Our next question is going to go to Lamine. And the reason why I'm very pleased about that is because we have synergy and collaboration here. And it's so important to be able to get the important factors out there. If we're looking at synergy, government is government. I think government does what it does, make laws, create an enabling environment, pass fiscal policies, as the case may be. Developers have their strengths as well, as do financiers. And if they're going to collaborate effectively, there needs to be a proper understanding. And I'm looking at real-time examples here. That's why I want to come to Lamin. So if we're looking at fostering synergy between all three, I want you to please give me some examples where you've had a brilliant synergy in the Gambia between government, government and the private sector, developers and financiers. What challenges did you experience and how did you get over these challenges, Lamin? Please unmute yourself.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, actually from the experience, that's the direct experience as government officials, we encounter some challenges, which I cannot make mention of all, but key and very present ones will be on the area of capacities and then experience. Government as Gambia has faced challenges due to lack of experience from the personnel within the government to handle certain PPP projects, very effectively and efficiently. Well, some of these investors have some edges over the personnel of the government, and then they have that dichotomy or paradigm shift over them altogether. In order to address this one, I think the capacity building issue has been, we are working with both local and international institutions. And then one that I wanted to make mention here clearly is the African Legal Support Facility, who provide capacity building opportunity for the Gambia as in-house training, and also the ECOWAS for the support on the training of the PPP units in order to go with contract and contract negotiations. The other challenges was the coordination challenges. This is often lack of the coordination between the government departments, that lead to the delay of the project implementation and misalignment of the priorities too. So for the Gambia, what we did was to work on improving these communications and then coordinations between the line ministries, departments, and then together, including the creation of the PPP technical committee that bring in all the key stakeholders as far as a particular procurement is concerned. Again, the very difficult one, which is still now facing the Gambia, is the model of transactions and procurement documents. This is very, very big challenging as I'm speaking to you. We don't have a template like the model RFQ template, the model RFP template, even contract templates. And then the contract templates was one of the very relevant binding agreements that the private sector and the government should look into. And then at our end, it's also a very big difficulty that we are looking at. So in order to address this, we are looking at working with international institutions who can come in to help in terms of even transaction advisory or providing a TA that will help us to develop these models so that at least, though we know that contracts may be different because there are different types of procurement, different sectors, but if you have a generic template that can be tailor-made and be adjusted, I think that will also help the government at least to get into a very reliable contract. Again, another one is the financing capacity, that's financing constraints. One of the problems that the government is facing right now is the funding of some of those prerequisites when it comes to PPP procurement, like feasibility studies, which is require a lot of money, viability gap assessments also. Government has only one source of income, primarily that's the budget, that is just tax-based economy, and then that also have another priority areas. So the earmark fund for this assessment is also a very relevant or difficult constraint or challenges that we are having right now. And then we are trying to address this by engaging in with the multilateral development banks, other institutions to secure funding. Most importantly, we are having some engagement with MCC, that's Millennium Challenge Corporation, that wanted to fund some of our feasibility studies that we are having in the Gambia. Then we have the risk perceptions, and these are very, very difficult ones. Investors who wanted to come, private sectors to invest, they have a lot of risks, especially investment risks. So they wanted to get sovereign guarantees, minimum revenue guarantees, and others. So this also became a very big challenge because government also giving them guarantees, you are also increasing your liability. Immediately guarantees are awarded, your liability will come, and then this became a contingency liability. And then it also have to go through the budget, where you have limited funds there. The fiscal space is very narrowed. So all those things are very strong challenges that we have. and then access to domestic and even international financing. Domestically, our financial sector was not that vibrant, and then the accessing funds to meet high investment projects also was a very big challenge that we have because of the banking arrangements we have. So we are trying to work on our capital market that now the government of the Gambia is working on, at least to have access to capital funds that will enable investment projects to go in without any constraint. And then also, which is very relevant for us, is the insufficient capacity in terms of negotiating PPP contracts. Because sometimes you build, you do the contract award, the next step is you go to negotiations, and then the private parties have a lot of expertisms, a lot of landed individuals that will come in. So they will use that challenges or opportunities, in order to at least swing the basement of the project to one side. So that also is a very big difficult thing that we are having. And then for nutshell, I think these are just the key few that I wanted to make GFIT for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really interesting. And what I picked up there, some of the challenges, and I like that you would tell us how you got through them. Some of them are still challenges. You've mentioned capacity building. You mentioned the support that you're able to get from ALSF, which I think is great. And then you mentioned financial constraints, and then what financiers expect from the government of Gambia. So what I want to look at now, I want to look at examples that we can learn from in fostering closer collaboration between public and the private sectors across Africa in terms of implementing our PPPs. But before I say that, I just want to address the audience and say that we have experts on this panel. If you have any questions, there will be a Q&A session at the end of this. But if you have any, you want to address them, you can use the chat box as well. And you can identify which panelist you would like to answer that question if you so wish. So that's just to, so, pardon me, don't know if that came through. So the next thing now I want to address, I want to ask Meta. I particularly want to look at, examples, because you're a country manager, and it's quite important that we can learn from your experience because you've got 5 countries. I want to get some practical experience and some examples of how perhaps you've looked at aligning the public sector and the private sector interests, because clearly the private sector have profitability and returns on investment as their primary goals, and also, but government is more interested in implementing and having infrastructure in place for its citizens to experience and enjoy. How has the IFC, and in your experience, how has there been a good collaboration and a merging of those interests to ensure that there's an alignment in the delivery of the projects?
Thank you, Dapo. I would like to respond to this question by giving pieces of examples. Instead of coming with one example in one country, I would like to give you different small parts of example coming from how we intervene in project as IFC. So IFC being a development institution, we intervene in project in different ways. We can come as lead advisor, like I said at the beginning, when it comes to advise governments on PPPs. We can also come as co-developer. Some big hydropower plant projects, sometimes, most of the time, are where we come as co-developer. We come from the early beginning and assist the government in the design, in making sure that the policy is there, and making sure that also the project that is going to come up is going to be a bankable project, sustainable project. Because at the end of the day, it's not only to provide an infrastructure just to fill the gap of infrastructure need for the country, but it has to be sustainable. And sustainability comes into so many aspects. And I must say that today, the World Bank Group is one of the institutions that has been able to come up with a very comprehensive and detailed framework when it comes to assessing and ensuring sustainability. So in Maputo, in Mozambique, years ago, the government, because Mozambique is really relies a lot on corridors, because it's a country which has a long side on coast, different ports, but there are also natural ports for many inland countries, Malawi, some coal, some mining coming from Zimbabwe, and even from South Africa. So for this country, trade and logistics is an important pillar of development. And one of the things they worked on years ago was the Nacala corridor, which involved a huge investment on rails, rehabilitating the existing rails, adding some new segments to allow the logistics from the Malawian border and Zambia to the port of Beira. And that was a big project that involved different institutions. IFC was there as the lead lenders to structure the financing and to make sure also that the project would be something appealing to the private sector. So this is an example, for example, of project where we come as a very pivotal role player in mobilizing private financing to reach one of the government development challenge. And in addition to that, something we do to increase the efficiency of our contribution is to bring also the World Bank. Like Mr. Lamin Fati was explaining, sometimes guarantees can be also a burden for the government, sovereign guarantee. So we can also solicit the World Bank for partial risk guarantee sometime, because what we say that we have to maximize finance for development. IFC has resources to help for development. World Bank has resources to help for the development. How do we use those resources in a very comprehensive way for the government, but also in a way that private sector can come and complement government resources? So when we are in the project, our risk analysis is really detailed in environment and social. Performance standards are very detailed, and mitigation are well assessed, so that when we reach financing, we make sure that these are not questions that are going to come and jeopardize the project later. At the technical level, at the design of the project level, we intervene with our expert specialists. Thanks to also the global experience that we have, we are able sometimes to adjust projects. I take one example of port project, for example. The country has already benefited from public funding to develop a terminal, a container terminal, but they wanted a private operator to come and operate. So we came and advised the government, but when they came with the project, it was for 13 meters of depth for this port. And we explained to them, but by the time you finish this project and you put it on the market, it will be outdated. Nowadays, if you want to attract big vessels, it has to be at least minus 15 meters. And we had this conversation at the beginning, they were blocked, but we did it. We did it. It involved some additional investment on the public side, but we make sure that they could mobilize that public funding so that they could go ahead with a port which was not going to be outdated in a very competitive environment. Another thing, for example, where we also bring our experience, sometimes the decision at the beginning, one government comes and say, I want to privatize my airport. We explain to them, you don't necessarily need to divest. You can keep your airport and make a concession. So we had also a long conversation, and we went through the different avenue of explanation for this government to understand that, in fact, concession was a much better solution for them rather than coming with a full divestment. So what I want to say here is that we play a pivotal role in any engagement we have to make sure that we are honest broker between what government public side wants and what the private sector needs. We tend to make sure that they come up with something which is balanced, because as soon as it's unbalanced, right, you end up with a concession which is cancelled, or you end up with a project that cannot close the financial the financial state, because there's a lot of things that do not please the lenders. So most of the projects, we bring this expertise. We bring also this mobilization of private capital in different consistencies. It could be funds, investment fund, it could be other lenders, it could be commercial bank. We also make sure in the project where we intervene that there's a tranche for commercial bank which are in the country, because we do not want also to get them out of business because the project is a big amount, etc. There's always a necessity of a local tranche, and we make sure that commercial banks in the country are always also involved. We try to be as inclusive as possible.
Great. Thank you very much. And that last thing is that I like that, you see, because I had already had down that because of your global reach, because of IFC's global reach, you try to achieve balance. And that's a very important thing. And sometimes it's difficult because when you're looking at the collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, because they have different drivers and the objectives are usually different, but there's a way of harnessing that. And I think that's what you've been talking about. And I guess this also comes from IFC being able to have a detailed analysis right from the beginning. So that's good to note, actually. It's good to note. One thing else I picked up, Meta, is that you mentioned that a concession. I'm a DG of a subnational public-private partnership agency. And we also have this where we look at the difference and implementing. Sometimes some projects are better as a concession, grant a concession, as opposed to a DBFO, as the case may be, depending on where you are in the project stream. So it's always very interesting to be able to make this kind of analogy. And talking about balance, I want to come to you, Mashoud. If you can just give me in 4 or 5 minutes, what are the biggest deterrents for private investors in Africa? What, I'm not talking about risks now. I'm looking at deterrence, because we need the private sector to be buoyant in Africa and for them to realize the viability and the great ROIs that exist in African PPPs. But I know there's some deterrents. What are these big deterrents and how can they be addressed? And I wanted to look at it I wanted to address what governments can do. So you're from the private sector. So you've mentioned, and I'm sure even those we don't know in your makeup in terms of the projects you've done with different countries in Africa. So you have that reach as well. So big deterrents, and what can government do to address these deterrents to investors?
Thank you very much. I think, as we know, PPPs, for example, are very, very well grounded in, legal agreements and contracts and laws, right? When we assess, for example, when at Africa, when we decide that, a sector is a priority for us, right? For example, when it comes to transmission lines, if I can use that as an example, right? When we prioritize countries where we want to go do, where we want to, take this concept to go educate the government or the PPP units on how projects can be done, if there are no enabling laws or frameworks, right? If the laws are too weak, right, this is a huge deterrent from our standpoint, right? This also goes to, the legal and institutional frameworks that exist in the country to consummate PPPs, right? But to resolve this, I think, as Lamine again mentioned earlier, the ALSF, the technical assistance windows of, a lot of the DFIs and similar resources can be leveraged to, we believe these can be leveraged to improve the institutional capacity within countries to consummate PPPs. So that is on the one hand. Now, I know you said, don't talk about risk, but the truth is, when you look at this thing, again, you go back to the risk, maybe not at the project level. Sometimes there are certain risks that, are at the country level and impact projects, across sectors, even beyond infrastructure, when it comes to attracting private capital into these countries. And one big risk today, or deterrent when it comes to investment today, is the management of currency and FX risk. Now, just to step back a little bit, currency risk is not a cancer. It's not a death sentence. It is a risk that is recognized. It goes beyond Africa. It exists all over the world. Now, I think where we think our governments can do a lot more is in the area of how to manage Forex risk. Today on the continent, when we talk about FX risk, we talk about natural hedges. I want to get paid in dollars rather than get paid in local currency, which is good. It serves the purpose of a project, but is it sustainable, right? The way we look at these things at Africa 50 is, our local public and private capital markets, they need to be developed and bolstered to ensure that they can also participate in infrastructure investment across the capital spectrum, whether it's project development, whether it's, it's lending or even equity for construction. I think, back to Naita's point around inclusivity, because the truth is, we always say project finance or PPPs is essentially multiple stakeholders coming to manage risk that they can manage. And we think the local markets, they have the potential, with a few tweaks here and there when it comes to policy and, enabling, them to participate in financing infrastructure. We think this is another area where we can find solutions to currency and FX risk in each of our markets across the continent. Now, another and very important, piece that, I would like for, my government colleagues that are on this webinar to pay attention to is exit opportunities, right? Money, we call money liquidity, right? Which is money has to find places where it goes in and it's well compensated, and beyond good compensation, it can get out to go do something else, right? Today, our focus has always been on, the fact that we need to make projects bankable so that, they can attract capital. But, a lot of the infrastructure investment funds today, and this is not an Africa 50 issue, but the truth is, like I said earlier, we are an ecosystem player. Our mandate is to crowd in more capital, globally into Africa. When you look at, various developed markets, right? When people go into projects, there are investors whose appetite or whose strategy is to go into projects at financial close and exit 2 years post-COD, right? For them to be able to deploy the same strategy in Africa, there needs to be exits. They need to see where that exit is coming from, right? There are investors where they need to see assets that are operational, have cash flows, and, there's a track record of payment by the utilities or the PPP or the revenue counterparties for them to be able to come in. So I think this is an area where, as we continue to think about how to crowd in capital, right, we need to make sure we're also thinking of ways to make sure capital is fungible and capital that comes in can get out. Because ultimately, when we talk about reducing the cost of funds, right, these are the key areas that investors look at when they want to price risk before going into a country. I think I'll stop there. And thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. It's very well answered, actually. It's also comprehensive. And clearly, whenever you have international investors, currency fluctuation and currency risk is always an issue. It's always something that, is on the table and needs to be discussed. And you also mentioned something which I imagine is quite interesting, that, you sought to draw the attention of the public sector players to be aware that it's germane to be aware that money needs to find exit avenues. And I think that's, I paraphrase, but I think that's what you were saying. So I think it's something that's not lost, but to see, we're looking for synergies and we're looking for ways to ensure that there is a symbiosis between the objective of the private sector and of the public sector. And that's what we're talking about. And I do believe we're getting there with these issues being flagged up. And I want to come to you now, Nasser, from your experience of representing, I imagine, working with different governments. You've worked across different countries and different continents. And I want you to, give us a good example of where there was a fantastic synergy. Maybe a complicated one, actually, or simple as the case may be, but where there were thorny issues and there was a divergence of opinion between the public sector and the private sector, but you were still able to deliver and bring both to the table so that there was a common understanding and a good delivery of the PPP project.
Yeah, that's a good one. The negotiations I've been in this field for more than 30 years, and I've negotiated several quite complex deals because, as you mentioned, I specialize in the social sector, so health, education, elderly care, and so on. And particularly when you're combining the services dimension with the infrastructure dimension, it just takes on a very different level of complexity. We actually we were advising the government of Oman on a deal in the last couple of years, which is a drug treatment and rehabilitation facility in a city called Sahar in Oman. That finally signed, so it's a good success story. But of course, it wasn't without its complications. And if we look at kind of the sources of complication, number one, it's never been done before. So there actually has not been a drug treatment and rehabilitation facility done as a PPP anywhere in the world. And Oman is not the most experienced country when it comes to public-private partnerships. In fact, the deal we advised on, and we were lead transaction advisors on, turned out to be the first deal that the Omani government signed in the social sector. So you can imagine how this kind of starts to stack up, because then you have a public body that doesn't have the experience of seeing these deals through in the social sector. It's not been done before, so you can't take out, you know, the tens, if not hundreds, of infrastructure school projects or infrastructure hospital projects that you can say, well, it worked there, so let's see how we can make it work here. A lot of the stuff that we developed was built from scratch. And then add to it that this had to be an operator-led initiative. So it wasn't about having a builder, a contractor, an EPC contractor that was, you know, would come in and play the role of a PPP developer. You had to have a drug treatment and rehabilitation operator come in to lead the deal. And of course, they don't have the experience either. So there you have a public side that doesn't have the depth of experience, and a private side that doesn't have the depth of experience. So a lot of it kind of falls back on the advisor to broker this. And thankfully, we had that expertise, not in drug treatment and rehab, but it's not the first time we do a first of its kind of deal. So we knew that. Now, you know, one of the most common pitfalls that you see in negotiations is getting a completely unbalanced risk allocation from the outset, because then you're really at ends of the spectrum and you're trying to get to a middle ground, which, you know, in many ways has already been reached on many other deals that were banked. So, you know, a key thing is not to do that. And here we tried our best, of course, not to do that. And the challenge becomes where you end up being off the middle ground that people will find acceptable, because there's a government policy or there's some reason why the government wouldn't put that out in their opening contract position. Thankfully, there weren't many of those, and it was possible through negotiation, through explanation, to reach a middle ground. In some cases, we were surprised, pleasantly surprised in a way, that the private partner was able to give in on the risk. But in other cases, the government also had to, you know, accept a position, or we found a middle ground. And often the middle ground is not about just, as they say, split it in the middle. It's actually coming to the same issue at an angle and trying to find a way in which you can unlock it so that it makes sense still for both parties. The other complexity in that was really defining the key performance indicators and getting both parties to agree to the KPIs. I had a project where we acted as project monitors on a dialysis project, and the KPIs were already put in place. And without mentioning specificities, our role on that project was to evaluate whether the private partner was meeting the KPIs or not. And we found that there were a few KPIs that they weren't meeting, but one of them they were not meeting on a consistent basis. And this surprised me because this was an experienced dialysis operator. And we found that this was the way the KPI was drafted and the level it was pitched at. It was almost impossible to reach it because it relied not only on the performance of the operator, but on how the patient themselves conducted themselves outside of the dialysis sessions. So if the patient didn't walk, didn't do the right level of exercise and movement, didn't look after their nutritional input, it became difficult to meet that KPI. But at the same time, the provider didn't say that, didn't voice it during the negotiation. So from that lesson, during the negotiations on this particular deal, I kept emphasizing this point. Myself and my team were going back to them. I'm not the healthcare specialist. We luckily had really outstanding healthcare specialists working on us on this deal with us. And I kept pressing the point that don't set them at a level that's going to deliver value, but don't set them at a level where it's just not going to be possible to deliver on them. And the same message to the private partner as we were going through the negotiations, saying, you have an opportunity to convince us that you cannot meet this and give us good rationale, in which case we can. And there weren't that many that were off the mark, but where they were off the mark and there were convincing arguments, we brought them together. And with that, of course, also the whole thing of how you measure KPIs, how frequently you measure them, and importantly with key performance indicators, which become a really big thing when you're looking at service-based PPPs. A key thing is the amount of time that you give to the private partner to remedy the situation, so that they have an opportunity to redeem it and not get themselves into a penalty situation. And of course, if they don't meet it, at what point do you start to ratchet up the penalty so that you incentivize them more to actually deal with it? And then how you set out the penalty itself, the quantum of penalty that you put in there, because you want it to bite, but you don't want it to bite so much that it can render a private operator bankrupt because of the level of penalty that they're having to incur. So all of these things really have to be taken in balance, and keeping in mind that the ultimate aim is actually to deliver a successful PPP. It's not about, trying to get a one-up or trying to outsmart the other side. What you want is to get service level improvement, get certainty of delivery, get efficiency in that and that efficiency will always translate into a reduction compared with the cost that government incurs, and therefore delivering value for money for the government. So they're the kind of things. In terms of, like, maybe if I have time, one or two other points that you would kind of safeguard against and that we experienced in there is vagueness. I think, the more clear you can be on contract terms, the more likely you are to get a faster closure of the negotiations, and the more likely you are to actually have a better time monitoring and delivering to that contract. And we found, for example, in this one, that when it came to the project company, they were called project company default events. So the types of events that can knock the private partner into a default situation. Not that they were necessarily that vague, but they were too broad. And what we then did during the negotiations was to literally break them down into about, if I remember, 12 or 15 different items of default events. And then for each of the default events to set very objective criteria for how that default would be measured. And what the outcome would be, whether there would be a payment deduction, whether there would be an immediate termination because it's such a gross default that you can't possibly bear. And of course, the ability for the private partner to challenge that, because we all know these things can sometimes be subjective. Even a person reading something objective might put their own subjective view on it. And therefore having the recourse in terms of having an independent expert, taking it through to arbitration and so on, if need be, for dispute resolution. So all of those things. So where there is vagueness, try to deal with it by introducing clarity, even if that feels painful at the time, it really pays off going forward. And then the last point really is engaging stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nasa. I liked, you started answering this question by talking about, the risk of, unbalanced risk allocation. And I think that's been mentioned several times, even in the previous sessions to this is session 4 of the Africa Roundtable. And you mentioned that the ultimate aim is to deliver a successful PPP. And I think that's a clever way, actually, because that's what everybody wants. The private sector, that's the aim. Same for the public sector. Now, thank you very much. I would have liked to go around one more time with the questions, but I think we're running out of time. I want to try to make sure that we get all we have for the session delivered for our listeners and the audience as well. Now, I have 1 or 2 questions, and we still want to encourage our audience to please use the Q&A box or chat if you like, and ask your questions. And if you can direct them to which panelist you would like to answer the question. I have one, the first question, let's just bring it up. I think this is going to go to Moshood. And he says that, I think you mentioned, and I even mentioned it in my remarks as well, Moshood, you mentioned capital being able to exit. And the question says, how will capital exit the partnership? And then also, will this be before utilization or post utilization? And I imagine utilization being project delivery. But the question I'll ask again, it says, how will capital exit the partnership? And will the capital exit before utilization? Please clarify. Moshood.
Yeah, thanks. And that's actually a very good question.
Moshood, forgive me. If you can do this in just 2 minutes, please. Just 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Sure. So, I mean, again, like just back to my point, right? When capital exits, it means that new capital has come in, right? That is how capital exits. Now, capital can exit at whatever time, as long as it doesn't jeopardize the operations of the project, its functional specifications, and delivery timeline. The idea is that, it's like a relay, right? When you run a relay, somebody has to run for, and then you hand over the baton and someone else, takes over. I think, in an ideal world, what we'd love to see is that we'd love to see significant capital coming, being attracted by infrastructure assets. And then that creates exits for everybody, because the market it's like the stock market, right? Every day when you want to buy, there's someone that's willing to sell. And when you want to sell tomorrow, there's someone that's willing to buy. That is the world that we envisage for infrastructure assets on the continent as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moshood. That's very succinct. I'm grateful to you for the way you answered the question. Very pointy as well. And I feel that whoever asked that question would have got the required response now. I think that we've more or less had a good go or a good start about the questions, the issues. And the key thing we were trying to address were to address strategies that would foster a closer collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, namely government, developers, and then, of course, financiers or funders. And I would like to thank my panelists very much. I would like to thank you very much, Lamin Fatih. I'd like to thank you very much, Nasa Masood, Moshood Abolade, Mahita Fani. Thank you so much. It's been great having you. It's been great getting your perspective as well on these issues at stake. And this is just, I think some of us are from the English-speaking part of the continent. Some of us are from the French-speaking part of the continent. So it's over. So it's not goodbye forever, because this is going to continue. And I think Peter, my colleague on the previous session, said that we'll probably need to have more to take the conversation further. But I really wish to say thank you very much for your time, for your expertise, and for your responses on this. So I would like to ask my panelists, please don't go yet. We still need you for 1 or 2 things on this session. So still stay on. And I'm going to hand over, as I'm closing this session now, this panel, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Prima, who is going to then close day 2 of the Africa Roundtable. Thank you very much once again, everyone. And have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oduwale. Thank you very much to the panelists as well. This has been a very insightful discussion. And really my job here is to close a very insightful, very engaging 2 days of the PPP Roundtable. And like we started yesterday, we decided to call this building a house, and we had an analogy of building a house, and I think we have built a house. We started the conversation yesterday with a discussion on preparation, which we called the foundation of our house. And as one of the panelists said, PPP and project driving projects using the PPP model is about preparation, preparation, preparation. We went on to build our walls, and we were talking about structuring for bankability, and it was clear from the discussion on structuring that you cannot just have good feasibility studies. You must be able to structure the project to ensure that the demand side and the supply side of PPPs and infrastructure on the continent actually move. Today, we had a very interesting discussion earlier that was moderated by Peter, and Peter was helping us to roof our house. And we were talking about how to de-risk projects. And I think what came out from that discussion was the need to ensure that we need to start thinking very seriously about using local currency to drive PPPs on the continent. And I think Mr. Oduale has helped us furnish our PPP space by talking about collaboration. I think we had a very well-constituted panel that showed us that it's important for all the players, for those that help with feasibility studies, for those that do transaction advisory like the IFC, for those that finance projects like Africa 50, and all the different players. It's very important that we all work together to ensure that we drive this agenda. So I think that our role at WAPPP was to spark conversation and to spark action. I hope that we have been able to spark conversation amongst yourselves. And if you would like to continue this conversation at the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals, we are happy to have you. We are a membership-based organization, and you can find out more about us on WAPPP.org. We also have a lot of activities throughout the year, and I'm sure you'll be able to follow us on LinkedIn to hear more about these activities. But I hope that you've been able to think deeper and to also think in your different spaces, what can you do to drive the conversation, but to also drive action on the continent. Thank you to all the panelists all the way from yesterday. Thank you very much to this panel that has been here today, and thank you to the participants. It's goodbye from us, and see you soon. Thank you very much.